The wind howled through the pine trees of Michigan's Huron National Forest with a violence that seemed almost personal, as if the wilderness itself was angry. December 15th, 1972, marked the beginning of what meteorologists would later call one of the most brutal winter storms in the region's recorded history. Snow fell in thick, suffocating curtains, transforming familiar hunting trails into alien landscapes where even experienced outdoorsmen could lose their bearings within minutes. It was exactly the kind of weather that should have kept any sensible person indoors, wrapped in wool blankets beside a crackling fireplace. But Robert Walsh and James Moore were not just any hunters. They were men who had spent their entire lives reading the moods of these Michigan woods, who could track a wounded deer through conditions that would blind lesser men. Walsh could identify animal tracks in snow so deep that most people would see only an endless white void. Moore possessed an almost supernatural ability to navigate by instinct when compasses failed and landmarks disappeared beneath drifting snow. Together, they had survived blizzards that had claimed other hunters, had walked out of forests where search parties had given up hope of finding them alive. Their reputation in Grayling was legendary. Parents told their children to hunt like Walsh and Moore if they wanted to come home safely, which makes what happened next all the more impossible to understand. By nightfall on December 18th, when the storm finally began to exhaust itself and the temperature dropped to a bone-numbing -15 degrees, both men had simply vanished. Not lost, not delayed by weather, not seeking shelter in some remote cabin until the roads cleared. Vanished. The word carries a terrible finality that their families would struggle to accept for the next 50 years. Experienced hunters don't just disappear. They leave tracks. They make mistakes that can be analyzed and understood. They succumb to explicable dangers like hypothermia or accidents with their weapons. They don't evaporate like morning mist when the sun hits fresh snow. The first sign that something had gone catastrophically wrong came from an unexpected source. Margaret Walsh had been married to Robert for 18 years, and she knew his patterns with the precision of a woman who had spent countless nights listening for the sound of his boots on the front porch. He always called home by 8 o'clock on the second night of any hunting trip, a ritual that had never varied regardless of weather conditions or hunting success. When the phone remained silent that December evening, she felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. Sarah Moore received Margaret's call at 10:30 that night, her voice tight with a worry that both women had learned to recognize over the years. "Have you heard from James?" The question hung between them like a physical thing, heavy with implications neither wanted to acknowledge. Sarah's immediate response was to check the weather reports, to rationalize the silence with logical explanations about downed phone lines and impassable roads. But deep down, in the place where wives store their worst fears, she already knew that something had gone terribly wrong. The storm that had swallowed their husbands showed no signs of mercy. Wind gusts reached 40 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions that made travel impossible even for the county's heavy equipment. Snow fell at a rate of 3 inches per hour, burying roads, vehicles, and any trace of human passage beneath a blanket of white that seemed to erase the very concept of civilization. By midnight, the two women sat in Margaret's kitchen, clutching coffee cups with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, watching snow pile against windows that had become mirrors reflecting their own terror back at them. What they didn't know, couldn't possibly have imagined as they waited for dawn and clearer skies, was that their husband's disappearance would become one of the most baffling unsolved cases in Michigan's history. The truth would remain buried beneath 50 years of changing seasons, hidden by the same wilderness that had shaped their men into legendary hunters, waiting for technology that didn't yet exist to finally reveal what had happened during those 3 terrible days when winter swallowed 2 of Grayling's finest and refused to give them back. Robert Walsh was 42 years old that December, a machinist at the Grayling Ford plant who had earned his reputation as one of the county's most skilled hunters through 30 years of tracking white-tailed deer through these same forests. His weathered hands bore the permanent stains of motor oil and the calluses of a man who worked with precision instruments. But those same hands could field dress a deer with surgical efficiency and read animal tracks like other men read newspapers. Friends described him as methodical, cautious, the kind of hunter who planned every trip with military precision and never took unnecessary risks. He carried the same Winchester Model 70 his father had given him for his 16th birthday, maintained it with obsessive care, and could place a shot within a 2-inch circle at 200 yards, even in adverse weather conditions. Robert's approach to hunting reflected his personality in ways that made him predictable to those who knew him well. He scouted locations for weeks before any major trip, studying topographical maps with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. His basement workshop contained detailed journals documenting 25 years of hunting expeditions, complete with weather conditions, animal movements, and precise GPS coordinates marking successful hunting spots. Margaret often found him there in the evenings, updating his records with the careful handwriting of a man who believed that preparation was the difference between success and failure, between coming home safely and becoming another cautionary tale. The planned December trip had been discussed and refined for months. Robert had identified a remote section of the Huron National Forest where deer signs suggested a well-established travel corridor between feeding and bedding areas. He had obtained the necessary permits, checked and double-checked weather forecasts, and assembled gear that could sustain 2 men for a week in harsh winter conditions. His methodical nature had served him well throughout his life, earning him respect at the plant where supervisors trusted him with the most delicate machinery repairs and establishing him as the hunter that other hunters came to for advice. James Moore presented a sharp contrast to his lifelong friend's measured approach, but in ways that had always complemented rather than conflicted with Robert's style. At 38, Moore possessed the restless energy of a man who had never quite settled into the rhythms of small-town life, despite having been born and raised in Grayling. Where Walsh was methodical, Moore was intuitive, reading the forest with instincts that seemed to bypass conscious thought entirely. He could sense changes in weather patterns hours before they manifested, could predict animal behavior with an accuracy that bordered on supernatural, and possessed an internal compass that had never failed him even in the most disorienting conditions. Moore worked sporadically as a carpenter and fishing guide, preferring the freedom of seasonal work to the steady paycheck that trapped so many of his contemporaries behind factory walls. His income fluctuated with the seasons and his mood, but he had never known genuine financial hardship because his skills as a guide were legendary throughout northern Michigan. Wealthy hunters from Detroit and Chicago specifically requested James Moore when they wanted to guarantee success in the wilderness, and his reputation had spread far enough that he occasionally received offers to guide expeditions in other states. Sarah Moore had married a man who seemed to contain some essential wildness that civilization could never fully tame. She had learned to read the signs that indicated when James needed to disappear into the forest, when the walls of their small house began to feel like a cage, and his eyes took on the distant look of someone whose spirit belonged among the trees. Their marriage worked because Sarah understood that trying to contain James would be like trying to bottle wind, and because James always returned home with stories that made her fall in love with him all over again. The friendship between Walsh and Moore had been forged in these very woods during the harsh winter of 1951, when they were both young men learning the ancient skills that connected them to the land their grandfathers had hunted. They understood each other with the wordless communication that develops between men who have shared countless dawns in deer blinds, who have dragged heavy bucks through miles of rough terrain, who have warmed themselves around the same campfires while the forest settled into darkness around them. Their hunting partnership had become the stuff of local legend, with stories told and retold in Grayling's bars and coffee shops about the time they tracked a wounded buck for 3 days through a late-season snowstorm, or the morning they took matching 8-point bucks within minutes of each other from the same stand. Sheriff Deputy Martin Crawford had seen his share of winter emergencies during his 15 years with the Crawford County Sheriff's Department. But nothing had prepared him for the logistical nightmare that began unfolding on the morning of December 19th. The storm had finally exhausted itself during the pre-dawn hours, leaving behind a crystalline silence that felt almost oppressive after 3 days of howling wind. Snow lay 4 feet deep across most of the county, with drifts reaching 8 feet in the hollows, and ravines where the wind had carved the landscape into alien sculptures of white. When Margaret Walsh's call came through the dispatch radio at 6:30 that morning, Crawford knew immediately that this would not be a routine missing persons case. The temperature had plummeted to negative 18 degrees overnight, cold enough to kill an unprepared person within hours of exposure. Crawford understood the mathematics of survival in these conditions with grim precision. Even experienced hunters like Walsh and Moore would be fighting hypothermia if they were trapped in the open without adequate shelter. Every hour that passed reduced their chances of survival exponentially. Yet the same storm that had endangered them now made mounting an effective search nearly impossible. Crawford's first challenge was simply reaching the remote access point where Walsh and Moore had planned to enter the forest. County road crews had been working around the clock to clear primary highways, but the dirt roads leading into the Huron National Forest remained impassable even for 4-wheel drive vehicles. The deputy organized a convoy of snowmobiles and recruited volunteers from the local search and rescue team, men who knew these woods almost as well as the missing hunters themselves. By 10 o'clock that morning, 12 searchers had assembled at the Mac Lake access point, their breath forming clouds in the bitter air as Crawford briefed them on search patterns and safety protocols. The discovery of Walsh's forest green Chevrolet pickup truck came within the first hour of the search, but rather than providing relief, it only deepened the mystery. The vehicle sat buried to its wheel wells in snow approximately half a mile from the access point, positioned at an odd angle that suggested it had been abandoned hastily rather than parked with Walsh's characteristic attention to detail. What disturbed Crawford most was the truck's location. Walsh had driven this route dozens of times over the years, and parking here made no tactical sense for accessing the hunting area he had described to his wife. It was too far from the trailhead, too exposed to wind, too difficult to extract if weather conditions deteriorated. Search team member Frank Sullivan, a local hunting guide who had known both missing men for over a decade, examined the truck with the careful attention of someone who understood that every detail might prove crucial. The doors were unlocked, which was unusual for hunters in remote areas where theft, though rare, was always a concern. Walsh's methodical nature extended to vehicle security, and Sullivan had never known him to leave a truck unlocked, even in the safest locations. Inside the cab, their hunting licenses lay neatly displayed on the dashboard as required by law, but other expected items were missing. Walsh's detailed topographical maps, which he consulted obsessively during any hunting trip, were nowhere to be found. The truck's bed contained equipment that raised more questions than it answered. 2 sleeping bags lay rolled and secured beneath a tarp, along with enough food for several days and a camp stove that showed no signs of recent use. Their rifles were absent, which made sense if they had taken them into the forest, but Sullivan noticed that Walsh's expensive rangefinder and Moore's prized compass were still in the truck. Both men treated these instruments as essential equipment, never venturing into unfamiliar territory without them. Finding them abandoned in the truck was like discovering a surgeon had left his scalpels at home. By afternoon, expanded search teams had deployed with military precision across a grid pattern covering 6 square miles of forest. Bloodhounds brought in from the state police struggled in the deep snow, their usual effectiveness hampered by the fact that any scent trail had been buried beneath 4 feet of precipitation. Helicopters from the Michigan National Guard flew reconnaissance patterns when visibility allowed, their crews scanning endless acres of white for any sign of the missing hunters or emergency signals. As darkness approached on that first day of searching, Crawford felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders like lead. 2 experienced hunters were somewhere in this frozen wilderness, and despite the efforts of 40 searchers, they had found nothing but an abandoned truck that raised more questions than it answered. The temperature was dropping again, promising another night of killing cold, and Crawford knew that time was becoming their enemy as surely as the weather. The brass casing lay half-buried in snow, beneath a towering white pine, its dull golden surface catching the weak December sunlight like a message left behind by the missing hunters. Deputy Crawford spotted it on the second day of searching, approximately 200 yards northeast of where Walsh's truck had been discovered. The .30-06 shell casing appeared fresh, its extraction marks clean and sharp, suggesting it had been fired recently rather than left behind by hunters from previous seasons. Crawford carefully photographed the casing from multiple angles before bagging it as evidence, noting its precise location on his growing map of potential clues. What made the discovery particularly significant was the caliber. Both Walsh and Moore carried .30-06 rifles, the most popular hunting cartridge in Michigan, but the location of the spent shell raised troubling questions. According to the detailed hunting plan that Walsh had discussed with his wife, the men should have been hunting several miles deeper into the forest, in an area where deer sign had been abundant during Walsh's earlier scouting trips. Finding evidence of recent gunfire so close to where they had abandoned their truck suggested either a dramatic change in their hunting strategy or something far more sinister. Crawford called in Detective Lieutenant Paul Hoffman from the state police, a 20-year veteran who had handled dozens of hunting accidents and missing persons cases throughout northern Michigan. Hoffman arrived that afternoon with a crime scene investigation kit and the kind of methodical approach that Crawford hoped might bring order to the growing collection of contradictory evidence. Together, they began expanding the search pattern around the shell casing location, looking for blood sign, additional brass, or any indication of what had prompted the hunters to fire their weapons in this particular spot. The search revealed a confusion of tracks in the snow that had been partially obscured by wind and subsequent snowfall. Hoffman identified what appeared to be boot prints from at least 2 different people, but the tracks led in multiple directions before disappearing entirely where the wind had scoured the snow down to bare ground. More disturbing was the absence of any clear blood trail or drag marks that would indicate a successful hunt. If Walsh or Moore had shot a deer in this location, there should have been obvious signs of field dressing and transportation back toward their truck. Dr. Elizabeth Santos, the county coroner who doubled as a forensic consultant for complex cases, examined the shell casing under laboratory conditions that evening. Her analysis revealed that the brass showed signs of having been fired from a rifle with a worn firing pin, creating a distinctive mark that could potentially be matched to a specific weapon if that rifle were ever recovered. More intriguingly, she discovered microscopic traces of what appeared to be human blood on the casing itself, though the amount was so small that determining its origin would require advanced testing that the county lab was not equipped to perform. As the search entered its 3rd day, Crawford found himself coordinating the efforts of nearly 60 volunteers, state police investigators, and emergency personnel. The operation had taken on the desperate urgency of a race against time, but the forest seemed determined to guard its secrets. Search dogs continued to struggle with the deep snow and conflicting scent trails that led nowhere. Helicopter reconnaissance flights provided aerial coverage of vast areas, but revealed nothing beyond the endless monotony of snow-covered trees and the occasional glimpse of wildlife tracks that only emphasized the absence of human presence. The witness interviews that Hoffman conducted throughout the week painted a picture of the missing hunters that was both consistent and baffling. Every person who knew Walsh and Moore described them as supremely competent outdoorsmen who would never take unnecessary risks, especially in dangerous weather conditions. Several hunters reported seeing the men at Murphy's Diner in Grayling on the morning of December 15th, their final confirmed sighting. According to waitress Dorothy Hamilton, both men had seemed in good spirits, discussing their hunting plans with the quiet confidence of veterans who had made such trips dozens of times before. More puzzling were the reports from other hunters who had been in the forest during the storm. 3 separate groups claimed to have heard rifle shots on the afternoon of December 16th, but their estimates of location varied wildly, and all admitted that the wind and snow had made it impossible to determine direction with any accuracy. One hunter, Thomas Fitzgerald, reported hearing what he described as multiple shots in rapid succession, but couldn't say whether they represented hunting activity or something more troubling. By the end of the first week, Crawford's case file had grown to include dozens of photographs, witness statements, and evidence bags, but none of the pieces formed a coherent picture of what had happened to Walsh and Moore. The shell casing remained their most tangible clue, yet it raised more questions than it answered. The trace amounts of blood that Dr. Santos had discovered seemed to suggest violence, but without more substantial evidence, Crawford couldn't determine whether they were investigating a hunting accident, a crime, or simply the tragic consequences of 2 experienced hunters making an uncharacteristic mistake in deadly weather conditions. The families clung to hope with the desperation of people who refused to accept what the evidence increasingly suggested. Margaret Walsh spent her days at the Search Command post, bringing coffee and sandwiches to volunteers while scanning their faces for any sign of encouragement. Sarah Moore drove the forest roads in her battered station wagon, stopping at every cabin and hunting camp to ask if anyone had seen her husband. Both women understood that each passing day reduced the likelihood of finding their husbands alive, but neither was willing to acknowledge that terrible arithmetic aloud. Margaret Walsh discovered that grief has its own geography, a terrain of sleepless nights and hollow days that stretches endlessly in all directions. By January 1973, when the official search had been suspended due to impassable winter conditions, she had already begun charting her own course through this unfamiliar landscape. The dining room table that had once held Robert's hunting journals and topographical maps now became her command center, covered with copies of police reports, contact information for private investigators, and detailed correspondence with every hunting guide, forest ranger, and law enforcement official who might possess even a fragment of useful information. The first private investigator Margaret hired was Thomas Kennedy, a former Detroit police detective who specialized in missing persons cases. Kennedy's fee consumed most of the couple's modest savings account, but Margaret paid it without hesitation, driven by a certainty that bordered on obsession that Robert was still alive somewhere in those frozen woods. Kennedy spent 2 weeks in February interviewing witnesses, retracing the search patterns, and examining evidence that the official investigation had catalogued. His final report, delivered with the careful diplomacy of a man who had learned to temper hope with reality, concluded that Walsh and Moore had most likely succumbed to exposure during the December storm, their bodies lying somewhere beneath the snow that would not melt until spring. Margaret rejected Kennedy's conclusions with the fierce intensity of a woman whose faith in her husband's survival skills outweighed all logic and evidence. She had lived with Robert for 18 years, had watched him navigate blizzards that had stranded experienced loggers, had seen him read weather patterns with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. The idea that a winter storm could claim him seemed not just impossible, but insulting to everything he had taught her about respecting the wilderness while refusing to be intimidated by it. Sarah Moore approached her husband's disappearance with a different kind of desperation, one that manifested in long drives through the forest roads surrounding the search area. Every weekend from February through April, she loaded her station wagon with camping gear, thermos bottles full of coffee, and maps marked with locations where James might have sought shelter. She established relationships with the caretakers of hunting camps and seasonal cabins, people who agreed to contact her immediately if they discovered any signs of recent human presence. Her kitchen table became covered with business cards from resort owners, hunting guides, and local residents who had promised to keep watch for any trace of her husband. The two women found themselves bound together by a grief that no one else in their small community could fully understand. They met every Thursday evening at Margaret's house, sharing coffee and theories, while snow continued to fall outside windows that had become mirrors, reflecting their own haunted faces back at them. These sessions took on the ritual significance of prayer meetings, with both women clinging to the belief that their combined determination could somehow overcome the mathematics of survival that everyone else had already accepted. As winter finally began its retreat in March, both families organized volunteer search parties that combed areas the official investigation had deemed too dangerous or unlikely to yield results. Margaret spent her weekends trudging through melting snow with groups of Robert's co-workers from the Ford plant, men who understood that searching was as much about honoring their missing friend's memory as it was about finding answers. They covered hundreds of acres over the course of 6 weeks, finding nothing but the detritus that winter always leaves behind: broken branches, animal bones bleached white by cold, and the occasional piece of trash left by hunters from previous seasons. Sarah's approach was more solitary, but equally systematic. She obtained copies of every topographical map covering the search area and began marking locations with a color-coded system that tracked weather patterns, animal movements, and the seasonal availability of natural shelter. Her maps grew increasingly complex throughout the spring and summer, covered with notations that documented her growing expertise in wilderness survival and search techniques. Friends who visited her home described seeing walls covered with photographs, maps, and handwritten timelines that created the impression of a detective's office rather than a kitchen where a grieving wife tried to make sense of her husband's disappearance. The financial cost of maintaining their private investigations forced both women to make sacrifices that their neighbors watched with a mixture of admiration and concern. Margaret took a part-time job at the Grayling grocery store, her first employment outside the home since her marriage, using her modest paycheck to fund continued searches and consultations with psychics, dowsers, and anyone else who claimed to possess insights that conventional investigation had missed. Detective Lieutenant Paul Hoffman retired from the Michigan State Police in 1988, taking with him the quiet frustration of a career that had seen more questions answered than not, but leaving behind one case that continued to gnaw at him like an old injury that ached before storms. The Walsh Moore disappearance had consumed portions of 3 winters, generated hundreds of pages of reports, and involved more man-hours of investigation than any missing persons case in Crawford County history. Yet for all the methodical police work, all the evidence collected and catalogued, all the witness interviews and forensic analysis, the case remained as baffling on Hoffman's last day of service as it had been when he first examined that brass shell casing in the snow 16 years earlier. The evidence boxes that contained the remnants of the investigation found their way into the basement storage area of the Crawford County Sheriff's Department, where they joined hundreds of other files from cases that had grown cold through the passage of time and the inevitable turnover of personnel. Sheriff's deputies who had participated in the original search gradually retired or transferred to other jurisdictions, taking with them the institutional memory that could have provided context for new investigators who might have brought fresh perspectives to the evidence. By 1995, when Detective Sarah Quinn joined the department as its first female investigator, the Walsh Moore case had become little more than a cautionary tale that older officers occasionally shared with rookies about the importance of thorough scene documentation and the dangers of making assumptions in wilderness disappearances. Quinn discovered the files by accident during a reorganization project aimed at digitizing the department's older case records. The boxes containing the Walsh Moore evidence had been mislabeled and misfiled, stacked behind water-damaged cartons from an unrelated arson investigation that had been solved and closed decades earlier. When Quinn finally located the correct materials, she found herself looking at a collection of evidence that told a story she couldn't quite comprehend. Photographs that seemed to document a crime scene without a clear crime, and witness statements that created more contradictions than they resolved. The physical evidence had deteriorated significantly during its years in storage. The original shell casing that had seemed so promising in 1972 had developed a patina of corrosion that obscured some of the firing pin marks that might have identified the specific rifle from which it had been fired. Photographs had faded to sepia tones that made them appear historical rather than forensic, and some of the paper documents bore water stains from a basement flood that had occurred during the spring of 1983. Quinn found herself working with evidence that felt more archaeological than investigative, artifacts from an investigation that predated many of the forensic techniques she had learned to rely upon. More troubling was the absence of any clear theory about what had actually happened to Walsh and Moore. The original investigators had documented their work with admirable thoroughness, but Quinn could find no indication that they had ever developed a coherent explanation for the evidence they had collected. The case file read like a collection of observations rather than an investigation, a catalogue of strange details that had never been assembled into a meaningful narrative. Hoffman's final report, filed just before his retirement, acknowledged this failure with the professional honesty of a detective who understood his limitations. The technological advances that occurred during the 1990s offered new possibilities for analyzing old evidence, but the Walsh Moore case seemed to resist even these improvements. DNA analysis, which had revolutionized forensic investigation, could not be applied to evidence that had been compromised by years of improper storage. Advanced ballistics techniques that might have identified the rifle that fired the mysterious shell casing were useless without a weapon to compare it against. Even computer modeling that could simulate weather patterns and human survival in wilderness conditions only confirmed what investigators had suspected from the beginning, that two experienced hunters should not have simply vanished without a trace. Quinn's attempts to interview original witnesses proved equally frustrating. Margaret Walsh had died in 1991, taking with her 30 years of theories, observations, and desperate hope that no one had ever fully documented. Sarah Moore had remarried and moved to California, starting a new life that deliberately excluded any reference to the husband who had disappeared into the Michigan woods. The few surviving search team members who Quinn was able to contact provided conflicting recollections that had been shaped by decades of retelling and the natural human tendency to fill gaps in memory with assumptions that felt more comfortable than uncertainty. By the winter of 1999, Quinn had spent 4 years periodically reviewing the Walsh Moore files whenever her caseload permitted, and she had concluded that the case would likely remain unsolved indefinitely. The evidence was too degraded, the witnesses too scattered or deceased, and the trail too cold for conventional investigative techniques to yield new insights. She prepared a comprehensive summary of her review for the case file, noting areas where modern forensic techniques might be applied if new evidence ever surfaced, but privately acknowledging that such a development seemed increasingly unlikely as the 20th century drew to a close. The boxes returned to their place in the basement storage area, where they would remain untouched for another 2 decades while new technologies developed and new investigators joined the department. The Walsh-Moore case had achieved the kind of cold case status that exists beyond active investigation, remembered only as a departmental legend and an example of how even the most thorough police work sometimes fails to provide the answers that families and communities desperately need. Detective Lieutenant Michael Anderson had been with the Crawford County Sheriff's Department for only 3 years when he inherited the Walsh-Moore case as part of a cold case review initiative launched in the winter of 2019. The department had received a federal grant designed to apply modern investigative techniques to unsolved cases from previous decades, and Anderson drew the assignment partly because of his background in digital forensics and partly because every other detective in the department had already spent enough sleepless nights staring at evidence that seemed to lead nowhere. Anderson approached the case with the confidence of someone who had never known the frustration of watching promising leads evaporate like morning mist, unaware that he was about to become the latest in a long line of investigators to be humbled by the stubborn mystery of 2 hunters who had simply vanished. The breakthrough came not from inspiration or brilliant deduction, but from technology that hadn't existed when Walsh and Moore disappeared into the Michigan woods 47 years earlier. Anderson had read about successful applications of ground-penetrating radar in archaeological investigations and cold case recoveries, and he wondered whether similar techniques might reveal what decades of conventional searching had missed. The equipment was expensive and specialized, requiring technicians trained in interpretation of subsurface anomalies, but the federal grant money made it possible to hire a consulting firm that specialized in forensic applications of advanced detection technology. Great Lakes Forensic Consulting arrived in Grayling during the first week of April 2019, bringing with them equipment that looked like something from a science fiction movie rather than a police investigation. The ground-penetrating radar unit consisted of a cart-mounted antenna system that could detect density variations in soil and rock formations up to 15 feet below the surface. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the team's lead technician, explained to Anderson that the device worked by sending electromagnetic pulses into the ground and measuring the time it took for those signals to return, creating a kind of underground map that could reveal buried objects, disturbed soil, or changes in geological composition that might indicate human activity. The team also brought advanced metal detection equipment that far exceeded the capabilities of the devices used in the original 1972 search. These new instruments could distinguish between different types of metal, estimate the size and depth of buried objects, and filter out the kind of scattered debris that had confused earlier searches. Most importantly, they could detect metallic objects that had been buried much deeper than the surface-level searching that had characterized the original investigation. Anderson spent the first day with Dr. Martinez's team establishing a systematic grid pattern that covered not only the original search area, but extended the perimeter by an additional quarter-mile in all directions. The technology allowed them to survey ground much more rapidly than foot searches, but the process still required methodical patience as they moved the equipment along precisely measured transects, marking GPS coordinates for every anomaly that registered on their instruments. The forest had changed significantly during the nearly 5 decades since Walsh and Moore's disappearance. Trees that had been saplings in 1972 now towered overhead, their root systems having grown through and around anything that might have been buried in the original soil. Undergrowth that had been manageable for the 1972 searchers now formed thick barriers that required clearing before the detection equipment could be properly deployed. Anderson found himself wondering whether the forest itself had become complicit in hiding whatever secrets lay beneath its floor. On the 3rd day of the technological survey, Dr. Martinez's ground-penetrating radar began detecting subsurface anomalies in an area approximately 300 yards from where Walsh's truck had been discovered. The readings suggested objects buried at depths between 4 and 8 feet, much deeper than any conventional search would have attempted in 1972. More intriguingly, the objects appeared to be clustered in a pattern that suggested deliberate placement rather than random scattering by natural forces. The metal detection sweeps of the same area confirmed the presence of ferrous objects consistent with hunting equipment, firearms, and other metallic items that 2 hunters might have carried. But the depth and arrangement of these objects raised immediate questions about how they had come to be buried so far below the surface. Natural processes like seasonal freeze-thaw cycles and organic decomposition could account for some burial over the course of 47 years, but the depths that Dr. Martinez's equipment was detecting suggested something more deliberate. Anderson felt the familiar electricity of a case that was finally beginning to yield its secrets, but he also understood that they were approaching a point of no return. Once they began excavating the anomalies that the technology had detected, they would either solve a mystery that had haunted Crawford County for nearly half a century, or they would add another layer of frustration to an already baffling case. The decision to proceed with excavation would require careful coordination with the state police, the medical examiner's office, and forensic specialists who could properly document and analyze whatever they might uncover. As Dr. Martinez prepared her equipment for more detailed scanning of the anomaly sites, Anderson found himself thinking about Margaret Walsh and Sarah Moore, women who had spent decades searching for answers that might finally be within reach. Neither woman had lived to see this moment, but their desperate pursuit of the truth had helped keep the case alive long enough for technology to catch up with the mystery that had consumed their lives. The excavation began at dawn on April 10, 2019, with a precision that would have been impossible during the frantic search efforts of 1972. Dr. Martinez had identified 3 distinct subsurface anomalies within a 20-foot radius, and Anderson had assembled a team that included forensic anthropologist Dr. Rebecca Sullivan from Michigan State University, crime scene photographer David Kim, and evidence technician Lisa Thompson. The site had been cordoned off with crime scene tape and surveying stakes, transforming a section of forest floor into something that resembled an archaeological dig more than a police investigation. The first anomaly yielded results within 2 hours of careful excavation. At a depth of 4 feet and 8 inches, Dr. Sullivan's brush revealed what appeared to be fabric that had been preserved by the acidic soil conditions and consistent moisture levels beneath the forest floor. The material showed signs of having once been wool, possibly from a hunting jacket or heavy shirt, and it contained metallic fasteners that had corroded but remained intact enough to suggest buttons or zipper components. Anderson photographed each stage of the excavation process, documenting the precise position and condition of every artifact as it emerged from soil that had hidden it for nearly 5 decades. The second excavation site, located approximately 12 feet from the first, revealed objects that immediately changed the nature of the investigation. Dr. Sullivan uncovered a Winchester Model 70 rifle buried at a depth of 6 feet, its wooden stock partially deteriorated, but its metal components preserved well enough that the serial number remained legible. Anderson felt his pulse quicken as he realized that this was almost certainly one of the rifles that Walsh and Moore had carried into the forest in December 1972. But the weapon's location and depth suggested that it had been deliberately buried rather than lost or abandoned during a struggle with the elements. More disturbing was the discovery 18 inches deeper of what Dr. Sullivan immediately recognized as human skeletal remains. The bones appeared to belong to an adult male, based on the size and structure of the skull and long bones that had been preserved by the soil conditions. Dr. Sullivan worked with painstaking care to expose the remains without disturbing their position, using brushes and small tools to reveal what appeared to be a complete skeleton that had been placed in the ground with obvious deliberation rather than having been scattered by natural processes or scavenging animals. The third excavation site yielded the most shocking discovery of all. At a depth of 7 feet, the team uncovered a second rifle, this one a Remington that showed signs of having been fired recently before its burial. But it was the discovery of additional skeletal remains, positioned in a way that suggested violence rather than accident, that transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into something far more sinister. Dr. Sullivan found what appeared to be trauma to the skull of the second set of remains, damage consistent with a gunshot wound that would have been immediately fatal. Anderson stood at the edge of the excavation sites as afternoon shadows began lengthening across the forest floor, trying to process the implications of what they had uncovered. The evidence suggested not just that Walsh and Moore had died in these woods 47 years earlier, but that their deaths had been deliberately concealed by someone who had taken considerable effort to bury both the bodies and the weapons deep enough to avoid detection by conventional search methods. The depth and careful arrangement of the remains indicated planning and forethought that was inconsistent with accidental death or even a spontaneous act of violence. Kim continued photographing every aspect of the excavation sites, while Thompson catalogued each piece of evidence according to strict chain-of-custody protocols. The process would continue for several more days as Dr. Sullivan carefully excavated and documented the complete skeletal remains, but Anderson already knew that they had discovered something that would rewrite the entire narrative of what had happened to Walsh and Moore during that December blizzard in 1972. The discovery of hunting equipment buried alongside the remains raised questions about the original crime scene investigation that Anderson found deeply troubling. The rifles, personal effects, and other metallic objects that the new technology had detected were buried well beyond the range of the metal detectors used in 1972, but the burial sites were located within the expanded search area that the original investigation should have covered. The implication that someone had been able to conceal 2 murders and the associated evidence literally under the noses of 40 searchers suggested either remarkable luck or knowledge of police search procedures that bordered on insider information. As the sun set over the Huron National Forest that evening, Anderson found himself facing the reality that the Walsh-Moore case had evolved from a mysterious disappearance into a double homicide that had remained hidden for nearly 5 decades. Someone had killed 2 experienced hunters during a December blizzard, buried their bodies and equipment with enough skill to avoid detection for 47 years, and then lived with that secret while families searched desperately for answers that lay buried beneath their feet. The question that would drive the remainder of the investigation was whether that someone was still alive, and whether advances in forensic science might finally be able to identify a killer who had gotten away with murder for nearly half a century. The Ballistics Laboratory at the Michigan State Police Headquarters in Lansing had handled thousands of firearms examinations during Dr. Patricia Chen's 15-year career as a forensic analyst, but the evidence from the Walsh-Moore case presented challenges that pushed the boundaries of what modern science could accomplish with artifacts that had spent nearly 5 decades buried in forest soil. The 30-06 shell casing that had been discovered at the original crime scene in 1972 arrived at her laboratory alongside the 2 rifles recovered from the excavation sites, creating an opportunity to finally answer questions that had puzzled investigators for 47 years. Chen's first task was determining whether the original shell casing had been fired from either of the recovered weapons. The brass showed significant corrosion from decades of exposure to moisture and acidic soil, but Chen was able to use digital comparison microscopy to examine the firing pin impressions and extractor marks that remained visible on the casing's base. The Winchester Model 70 that had belonged to Robert Walsh showed firing pin characteristics that clearly did not match the markings on the shell casing, eliminating one possibility but raising new questions about the sequence of events that had led to the hunters' deaths. The examination of James Moore's Remington rifle provided results that were both more definitive and more disturbing. The firing pin impressions on the original shell casing matched perfectly with test rounds fired from Moore's weapon, confirming that this rifle had indeed fired the shot that left the brass evidence at the scene in 1972. But Chen's analysis revealed details that transformed her understanding of what had happened during those final moments in the Michigan woods. The extractor marks on the casing showed irregularities consistent with rapid, forceful ejection rather than the controlled extraction that would characterize normal hunting activity. More significantly, Chen discovered microscopic traces of blood on the interior surface of the rifle's barrel, evidence that had been preserved by the weapon's burial in oxygen-poor soil conditions. DNA analysis of these traces, conducted by the State Police Laboratory's Genetic Analysis Unit, provided results that would have been impossible to obtain in 1972, but were now routine applications of modern forensic science. The blood belonged to Robert Walsh, confirming what the ballistics evidence had already suggested, that Moore's rifle had been used to kill his longtime hunting partner. The revelation that James Moore had shot Robert Walsh created a narrative that explained some aspects of the case while raising even more troubling questions. Chen's detailed examination of both rifles revealed that Walsh's Winchester had also been fired recently before its burial, with powder residue and barrel fouling consistent with at least one discharge. This discovery suggested that the deaths might have resulted from some kind of confrontation between the two friends, rather than a simple ambush or premeditated murder. The forensic analysis expanded to include examination of the skeletal remains that Dr. Sullivan had carefully excavated from the burial sites. The trauma to Walsh's skull was consistent with a close-range gunshot wound from a .30-06 rifle, with bone fracture patterns that indicated the bullet had entered from behind and slightly to the left, suggesting that Walsh had been shot while turned away from his attacker. The trajectory analysis placed Moore as the shooter, standing approximately 6 feet behind his friend when he pulled the trigger. Moore's remains told a different story, one that initially puzzled the forensic team until Chen's ballistics analysis provided the missing piece of the puzzle. The damage to Moore's skull was consistent with a self-inflicted gunshot wound, with the trajectory and powder burn patterns indicating that he had placed Walsh's rifle under his chin and used a long stick or branch to reach the trigger. This discovery suggested that Moore had shot his friend and then immediately taken his own life, but the elaborate burial of both bodies and all evidence indicated planning that seemed inconsistent with a spontaneous murder-suicide. The examination of personal effects recovered from the burial sites revealed additional details that helped reconstruct the final hours of both men's lives. Moore's wallet contained a handwritten note that had been preserved by the leather's protective qualities and the soil conditions. The note, written in Moore's distinctive handwriting, consisted of only a few lines. "I couldn't let him tell Sarah. I'm sorry for everything. The money is buried near the old cabin. God forgive me." The reference to money suggested a motive that investigators had never considered during the original investigation. Chen's final report documented evidence of a financial crime that had apparently led to murder when Walsh discovered Moore's theft and threatened to expose him. The exact nature of Moore's crime remained unclear, but the note's reference to buried money near the old cabin provided a lead that Anderson immediately began pursuing. Property records from Crawford County revealed several abandoned structures in the forest that matched the description, locations where Moore might have hidden stolen funds that Walsh had somehow discovered. The ballistics evidence painted a picture of two friends whose relationship had been destroyed by betrayal and desperation, leading to a confrontation in the Michigan woods that ended with both men dead and buried in graves that their killer had dug with the methodical precision that had characterized Moore's approach to everything in life. The same skills that had made him a legendary hunting guide had enabled him to conceal his crimes for nearly 5 decades, creating a mystery that had tormented 2 families and frustrated dozens of investigators. As Chen prepared her final report for submission to the district attorney's office, she reflected on the tragic irony that Moore's greatest success as a woodsman had been in hiding the evidence of his greatest failure as a human being. The man who had guided others safely through the wilderness had used his knowledge of the forest to become both murderer and undertaker, creating a secret that had taken 47 years and advanced technology to finally reveal. The Crawford County District Attorney's Office formally closed the Walsh-Moore case on November 15, 2019, exactly 47 years and 11 months after 2 hunters had driven into the Huron National Forest and never returned home. District Attorney Amanda Rodriguez announced the resolution at a press conference that was attended by members of both families, local media, and law enforcement officials who had worked on the case across 5 decades. The room fell silent as Rodriguez read the forensic conclusions that finally explained what had happened during those 3 terrible days in December 1972, when friendship had been destroyed by secrets that proved too dark to survive. The official determination was that James Moore had murdered Robert Walsh in a confrontation over Moore's theft of an undetermined amount of money, then taken his own life in a murder-suicide that he had carefully concealed to protect his reputation and spare his family the shame of learning the truth. The elaborate burial of both bodies and all evidence demonstrated a level of planning that suggested Moore had anticipated this outcome, possibly for weeks or months before the final confrontation occurred. The case was closed as a solved homicide with the perpetrator deceased, bringing legal resolution to a mystery that had haunted Crawford County for nearly half a century. Sarah Moore, now 79 years old and living in Sacramento, California, received notification of the case resolution through a phone call from Detective Anderson that lasted nearly 2 hours. She had remarried in 1981 and built a new life that deliberately excluded any reference to her first husband's disappearance, but the news of James's crimes shattered the carefully constructed peace she had maintained for 4 decades. In a statement read by her attorney, Sarah expressed relief that the families finally had answers, while acknowledging that learning the truth about James's actions had reopened wounds she had thought were permanently healed. Margaret Walsh's children, now middle-aged adults with families of their own, gathered at the Grayling cemetery where their mother was buried to hear Detective Anderson explain the circumstances of their father's death. Robert Walsh Jr., who had been 14 years old when his father disappeared, struggled to reconcile the image of James Moore he remembered from childhood with the man who had murdered his father and hidden the crime for decades. The family issued a statement expressing gratitude for the closure, while noting that learning their father had been betrayed and killed by his best friend added a layer of pain to grief they had been carrying for most of their lives. The discovery of Moore's hidden cache of money, found buried near an abandoned hunting cabin exactly where his suicide note had indicated, revealed the scope of the theft that had apparently motivated the murder. State police recovered approximately $37,000 in cash, a substantial sum in 1972 that would be equivalent to nearly $250,000 in 2019 currency. The money appeared to be the proceeds from a series of guide service fees that Moore had collected but never reported to the state licensing authority, representing years of tax evasion that could have resulted in criminal charges and imprisonment if Walsh had reported his discovery to authorities. Detective Anderson's final case report noted the bitter irony that Moore's reputation as the most trustworthy hunting guide in northern Michigan had enabled him to steal from clients who paid him in cash and never suspected that their guide was systematically cheating the state revenue service. Walsh's discovery of the theft had apparently occurred during the December hunting trip, possibly when Moore was forced to explain why he was carrying an unusually large amount of cash in the wilderness. The confrontation that followed had escalated to murder, when Moore realized that his lifelong friend intended to report the crime regardless of their personal relationship. The resolution of the case brought mixed emotions to the law enforcement officers who had worked on the investigation across multiple decades. Sheriff's Deputy Martin Crawford, now 83 and living in a Grayling nursing home, expressed satisfaction that the case had finally been solved, while acknowledging that the truth was more devastating than anyone had imagined during the original search efforts. Crawford noted that the 1972 investigation had focused on finding two missing hunters rather than investigating a crime, and that the technology needed to uncover Moore's carefully concealed burial sites had simply not existed at the time. The Walsh-Moore case became a textbook example of how advances in forensic technology could solve crimes that had seemed impossible to resolve using conventional investigative methods. The combination of ground-penetrating radar, advanced ballistics analysis, and DNA testing had revealed evidence that had been literally buried beyond the reach of 1970s police work. Criminal justice programs at several Michigan universities began using the case as a teaching tool to demonstrate both the importance of thorough evidence preservation and the potential for future technological advances to solve seemingly impossible cases. As winter returned to the Huron National Forest in late 2019, the burial sites where Walsh and Moore had been discovered were marked only by small depressions in the forest floor and metal stakes that would eventually be removed when the crime scene was officially released. The secret that had been hidden beneath 50 seasons of snow and falling leaves had finally been revealed, but the forest itself seemed unchanged by the human drama that had played out among its trees. The woods that had witnessed friendship's betrayal and covered the evidence of murder continued their eternal cycle of growth and decay, indifferent to the pain that humans carried and the justice they sought in the shadows beneath the pines. If you followed this investigation from the beginning, you understand how cold cases can remain unsolved for decades until technology catches up with the evidence. Share your thoughts in the comments about what might have happened if Robert Walsh had never discovered his friend's secret. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into cases where the truth lay hidden longer than anyone imagined possible.